Hi everyone, and welcome to this lunchtime talk hosted by Southampton University's Christian Union. And thank you for joining us from wherever you are at the moment. My name is Esther and I'm a second year biomed student, and I'm the new outreach coordinator for the Christian Union. So today we are really excited to be hearing from Professor Keith Fox, who is talking on how can we believe in a God who allows coronavirus. So Keith, could you please introduce yourself? What do you do and how are you involved with Southampton University?
Hi, Esther. Hi, everybody. So I'm a Professor of Biochemistry in the School of Biological Sciences in the university. I've been there for about 30 years now. My interests are in DNA. I think DNA happens to be the most fascinating molecule in the universe. That might surprise some people. And as well as being at Southampton University, half of my time I'm actually based in Cambridge, where I'm Associate Director of something called the Faraday Institute for Science and Religion, which is all about showing the complementarity between Christian faith and a scientific view of the world and how those don't conflict with each other. So that's me.
Sweet. So could you let us know an interesting fact about yourself?
What do? I do quite a bit of running. So if you're up early enough in the morning, you'll see me running around the common. I do the occasional half marathon. And when the park runs are running, I'm a regular park runner. But of course, at the moment, that's all stopped.
Yeah, unfortunately. And just a final quirky question. What is your favourite dessert if you'd had to choose?
That's a tough one because my wife loves making puddings and desserts. I eventually came down on that one. I think I'd go for a pavlova. Except, of course, pavlovas sometimes go wrong. And when that happens, they're called an eaten mess. My daughter once made one for us and it did go wrong. And of course, she had nothing to do with eating. So she presented us with what she called a state school mess. So yeah, pavlova for me.
Oh, nice. Cool. So before Keith starts, he's going to be talking for around 25, 30 minutes. So afterwards, we're going to have a Q&A session. If you have any questions, there is a Google form you can fill out anonymously if you like, linked in the description, or you can visit suku.uk/questions. Alternatively, if you have any further questions after the talk, you can contact the Suku's Question a Christian Facebook page, where a member of the CU will be happy to get in touch with you. And that's all I have to say. So yeah, Keith, I'll let you take the floor now.
Great, thank you, Esther. And I'm going to see if I can manage to share my screen, and we'll see if we can get the technology to work. Hey, this looks fun. So we're talking about coronavirus, COVID-19. It's a terrible pandemic, isn't it, which is sweeping the world, having effects on global health and wealth and well-being, with really tragic consequences for many people who prematurely lose relatives or friends. And we're seeing heroic examples from people of those in frontline work, whether that's in the caring professions or those in running essential services. So it's a desperate time for us. But actually, before we get into COVID, we need to think, is this the worst thing that mankind has ever experienced? Let's put coronavirus in a context of other things that are going on in the world. Black Death in the Middle Ages killed probably 50% of the population. Spanish flu at the end of the First World War, 1918, probably killed between 50 and 100 million people, more than were killed in the First World War altogether. HIV, we know, has already killed 35 million people. And on a daily basis, something like 10 to 15,000 children die of preventable diseases. That's 1 every 5 seconds. And I was amazed when I looked at the statistics. Something like 1.5 million people die every year in road traffic accidents. I couldn't believe that. I had to double check it. Most of them not in Europe, but a phenomenal number of tragedies going on. So we ask the question, where is God in all this? Does he care? And does he even exist? If we're going to rile at God for coronavirus, we should be concerned about all these other things as well, even more so. Where is God in all this? Why does he allow it to happen? Is it even evidence that God doesn't exist? Or is there just at the bottom, is there only molecules and blind, pitiless indifference? Things just happen. But before we even get to thinking about coronavirus, we need to at least step back and realize that there are two ways of looking at this. One is to ask the theoretical philosophical question, which is largely what we'll be talking about today. But there's also the pastoral one. And for somebody who is suffering with whatever affliction, cold theoretical arguments for maybe the origin of suffering are just sometimes badly appropriate. For them, they need the support of friends and family to stand with them. And often words are just not enough. Now, in the book of Job in the Bible, Job, the chief character, was a righteous man. He suffered unjustly. He lost his health, his wealth, his family. He lost everything. And comforters came to be with him at the beginning. And they presented him with rational arguments that really were not a great deal of use at all. But right at the beginning, we read that they sat with Job for 7 days and 7 nights, and no one spoke a word to him, for they saw that his suffering was very great. Words sometimes are even too much. And that's what's made some of the lockdowns so difficult. We can't get alongside and grieve and comfort family and friends. We can't gain consolation and comfort from them. And for me, during this time of lockdown, my mother died, not of the coronavirus. And it was not an easy time of grieving together without being together. So the awful question for this afternoon is, how can God allow such awful things to happen? Now, we tend to think we're quite clever. It's a new question for us, but it's not. It's a very old question. Epicurus, an ancient Greek pagan philosopher, phrased it like this: if a perfectly good God exists, then surely evil does not. There is evil in the world, therefore maybe a perfectly good God does not exist. Or as the philosopher David Hume put it, is God willing to prevent evil but not able? Then he's not omnipotent. Is he able but not willing? Then he's malevolent. Or to put it another way, if God is omnipotent, then he could prevent suffering from existing in the world. If God is omniscient, then he would know there was suffering in the world. If he's all loving, he'd want to stop the suffering. But there is suffering. So where is God? Is the fact that bad things happen to good people an argument against God's existence? Well, firstly, we need to be quite clear that Christians don't deny these things. They don't deny suffering. It's real. The Bible is full of people who suffer, from the psalmist who screamed at God, "Why have you forgotten me? What is this that's happening? It's just not fair. Why is it the rich prosper and the poor go to the wall? The good people are in trouble." They cry to God. It's not fair. But they don't question God's existence. The agony of Job that I already mentioned, Christ in his crucifixion, they all cry out to God, but actually they don't question his existence. They question the way that he works. Job, as he loses his family, his property, and his health, he questions God's justice and questions God's goodness, but he actually doesn't question God's existence. Now, it may not surprise you that there's inevitably people who take things in a rather strange way. There are those who really deny the origin of suffering and say, well, it's all part of God's judgment, isn't it? This is God getting his own back on a society for whatever they see as the perceived prevailing sin. It's usually either abortion or some sexual deviation. So that they think this is an act of judgment from God. Or there are others who claim that, well, God will protect them from all harm anyway. It's not a problem. If you trust in Jesus, Jesus is my vaccine. There was an American poster. And I think rather sadly, I heard that the person carrying that then a few weeks later died of the coronavirus infection. Both of these extremes, let's be quite clear, are aberrations of the Christian faith. They're distortions, they're untruths. But if God is good, and if he has declared his creation to be, in fact, very good, then why is there coronavirus and why is there suffering? We need to ask a question: is actually the coronavirus part of God's good creation? Is this virus evil? Well, let's be clear. Viruses themselves, I don't think they are evil. They have no moral qualities. They aren't even alive. They're simple pieces of DNA and RNA that are coated with protein and maybe lipid. They hijack cells, the cell material, to replicate and make copies of themselves. There are millions of them. Well, no, that's an underestimation. There's reckoned that in the world at any time, there are about 10 to the power 31, that's 1 with 31 noughts after it, viruses in the world, of a whole variety of different varieties. Some are useful, some are benign, and a few cause diseases. There are things like bacteriophages, viruses that infect bacteria. They play a role in keeping them in check. Plant viruses can confer tolerance to drought and freezing temperatures, and our own genomes contain remnants of retrovirus that have been incorporated over many, many years, some of which we now know have been co-opted for useful functions, even, for instance, the formation of the human placenta. So just like earthquakes and tornadoes, viruses sometimes cause harm, suffering, and death. But without them, life might not even be possible. Now, some Christians want to attribute the unpleasant things in the world to the fall, to man's rebellion against God. And there is some truth in this. But all the evidence is that viruses and other forms of suffering existed long before mankind ever appeared on the scene. Nature itself didn't change when we rebelled against God, though our relationship with it certainly did. And work became a drudgery and a toil. You see, there is no causal connection between human sin and the appearance of suffering and death in the world, although our relationship with the world changed. And it's easy to take a viral infection personally, isn't it? Attributing malice and cruelty to an unwelcome biological phenomenon. But the actions of a virus are in many respects no different to the actions of the weather. And just as accurate weather forecasting can save lives, so accurate understanding the nature of viruses in our world can also save lives. It's the effective development and use of vaccines and antiviral drugs that, after all, has nullified catastrophic effects of some of the world's deadliest infections, such as smallpox, which is now eradicated. And just as a slight digression, I might mention the work of Edward Jenner, who was fundamental in smallpox vaccination. Edward Jenner heard a cowherd say, "I shall never have smallpox, for I've had cowpox." And it was commonly believed that dairymaids who frequently caught cowpox were protected from smallpox in some totally unknown way. And Edward Jenner did a rather unethical experiment in 1796. He found a dairymaid who had fresh cowpox lesions, and he used those to inoculate a 7-year-old boy. Well, the boy developed a mild fever, but he recovered. A month or so later, he then inoculated the boy with smallpox itself. There's a risky experiment, from a fresh smallpox lesion. And he didn't develop the disease. Jenner was a Christian. And Jenner reported to have said the whole creation is the work of God's hands. It cannot manage itself. Man cannot manage it. Therefore, God is the manager. Now, I might take issue with the subtlety of that. But the fact is that it needs looking after. So viruses themselves are amoral. They have no moral qualities of their own. The emergence of this virus may have something to do with human irresponsibility and our mismanagement of nature. We don't know exactly where it came from, but it seems likely that it's crossed between species, maybe involving bats or pangolins as a result of poor practices in live food markets, where animals that wouldn't normally have close encounters in the wild are kept together in confined spaces where they can exchange viral infections. The way that we care for the planet does have consequences. That's not to say that God has sent this on us as a specific act of judgment, but the world works in ways that when we misuse it, it does have consequences. Of course, in the wonderful world of that lovely picture language of Genesis, God described the world as good, in fact, very good, when it was finished. So where do viruses fit in with that? A virus is part of God's good creation. After all, the opening words of John's Gospel talks about Without him, nothing has been made that has been made, viruses included. Well, maybe we need to understand what that word good means. I've put some things on the screen there from the Theological Dictionary of the Old Testament as to what that Hebrew word good means. It means fit for purpose. It means something that works. God has established the world so that it works. Science does indeed work. The world works. And in a sense, that's remarkable that we can investigate the world. As Einstein said, the most incomprehensible thing about the world is that it's comprehensible. It works in a predictable fashion. Science works, and we can understand the world. We can begin to understand how this virus infects people and how it replicates, and to design ways of stopping it. And it's actually a sign of God's goodness to us that he's made a world that is understandable by science and that can be used for the common good. So those words good don't necessarily imply moral perfection. The world that God made is fit for purpose. It works. And you know what? God, when he made the world, instructed humans that we should be fruitful, increase in number, fill the earth, and subdue it. Subdue a good world. There was work for humans to do, work that God has entrusted to humans to make it better even, to subdue it. And part of that work is to understand and control even harmful viruses. At the end of Job's trouble, God doesn't actually give him a good reason for his suffering, but he takes him on a whirlwind tour of the universe and says, do you understand? Do you get this? It's all mine. I do this. And there's a hint in what God is saying to Job that maybe if you stood aside and tried to understand, if you worked out how the world worked, maybe you might be better able to alleviate some of the disease and the suffering that comes in it. But is there a point to suffering? Is it all pointless and meaningless? Philosophers have debated this for centuries, trying to construct theodicies, as they call them, theological and philosophical justifications for why God allows suffering. The simple fact is that none of them are totally satisfactory. We don't know the mind of God, though the existence of suffering itself is not sufficient to argue against God's existence. But let's think for a moment. Could God have made a world without suffering? Well, I don't know, but the fact of the matter is that he didn't. There is suffering in the world. You know, there are serious risks involved in living on planet Earth. Good things also have downsides. Fire warms, yet it kills, it burns. Water refreshes, yet people drown. Could God have made such a bio-friendly world without gravity and fire and water and tectonic plates and microorganisms and viruses? If he could, I don't think we could imagine it. You see, not all pain is bad. God created us with nerve endings that use pain to protect us. Pain keeps us from burning our hands in the campfire and bending our legs back until the joints break, neglecting to eat until we starve. Now, you may argue you can't see the point of suffering. Sometimes I can't either. So conclude that, well, because I can't see it, there isn't a point. But the fact that I can't see the point of suffering doesn't mean that there isn't one. It's actually a type of blind faith to say that. You know, it's possible that God might have morally sufficient reasons to allow suffering to persist that I just don't understand. Try for a moment to imagine a world that contains people but no suffering, a sort of magical world where there'd be nothing that could cause suffering or harm at all. So why didn't God create that magical world instead of ours? Well, because I think its occupants wouldn't be. In fact, I think they couldn't be truly good people. It's not that they'd all be bad. It's that they couldn't have opportunity to be properly good and loving. For goodness develops where it's needed. In that world, there'll be no danger that requires people to be brave, so there'll be no bravery. That world would contain no one who needed comfort or kindness or sympathy, so none would be given. It's a world without moral goodness or moral badness. We might argue that some suffering even produces goodness. We might also say, well, if God were good, surely he'd want to make his creatures perfectly happy. If he were almighty, he'd be able to do that, but evidently his creatures are not happy. Sure, does then God lack either goodness or power or both? But maybe that's a false assumption. Is God's plan that we should be happy, just happy, smiley all the time, skipping along with no problems? No, actually, the Christian would say the chief purpose in life isn't just happiness, although we shouldn't go around with hair shirts all the time being morose. The chief purpose in life isn't happiness, but the knowledge of God. We might think as to whether there are some things that God cannot do. Well, he can't contradict his own character. It's possible that God, even though he's all-powerful, simply could not create a world without virus infections. We simply don't know. Can God do whatever he pleases? Well, yes, except God can't do the impossible. God cannot make a square circle. God cannot make 2 + 2 = 6. You can make all sorts of nonsense, and to attribute it to God, it still remains nonsense. The writer and philosopher C.S. Lewis asks us to consider what goodness means. Is suffering inconsistent with a good and loving God? We're inclined to sentimentalize about this and think what the love of God is like in our own terms. God's love is not like a senile benevolence, he put it, that drowsily wishes you to be happy in your own way, but is the consuming fire itself, the love that made the world. Real life implies suffering. Were God to take suffering away from us, he would take away the precious gift of life itself. The problem of reconciling human suffering with the existence of God, who loves us, is insoluble only so long as we attach a trivial meaning to the word love and happiness. Now, we can only guess at the mind of God as to the reasons for suffering. After all, his thoughts are far higher than ours. Now, this isn't blind faith, but it's trusting God on the basis of other evidence that he is good and merciful and just and kind. But we're still inclined to ask for reasons. We ask for reasons. Why did this happen? We ask for purpose. But more than reasons for how did it happen, we should ask for what should I do now? What does this say to how I should behave? And I want to give you two examples, two incidents from the life of Jesus that concern disease and disaster. In John's Gospel, we have the story of a man who was born blind. And the disciples asked Jesus, who sinned? Was it him or his parents that he was born blind? It's a sort of gotcha type question. Now, if Jesus had said his parents, then that would have raised the question of fairness. Why should he be afflicted if it was his parents who'd done wrong? And if he'd said the man himself, well, that would be gotcha as well, because, well, how could he possibly have sinned? Because he's been blind since birth. So how should he answer that? Jesus said, no, it's nothing to do with this at all. This happens so that the works of God might be displayed in him. Don't ask the question for the moment about the reason for why it happened in the past. Think about what this says for us in the future. How should we respond? The second incident is one reported in Luke's Gospel, where Jesus is challenged about an incident where a tower had fallen on people and 18 people had died. And he's saying, do you think they were more guilty than anybody else in Jerusalem who just wasn't killed by that? And again, the answer is no. But again, he pushes things forward. This should make you think for a moment. Others were killed, you're not. Unless you repent, he says, you also will perish. Tragedy often can be an object lesson for us to reflect on our own situation. Think who we are, why we are, what we're doing with our life, rather than ask the question of why does it happen? You see, suffering brings home to us the distressing fact of our own mortality. It reminds us of our frailty and hints at our coming death. But all must die, and these are words from Alistair McGrath, all must die, and any worldview that cannot cope with death is fatally deficient. Suffering, virus infections, coronavirus, gently prods our consciousness and forces us to contemplate the unpalatable, but the real fact of our future death and how our outlook on life relates to this rather sobering thought. I was in a laboratory, an undergraduate laboratory, many years ago, when there was a very small accident. And the student involved looked up and said, does that mean I'm going to die? And my colleague, rather jokingly, replied, yes, of course you're going to die, but that might be another 70 or 80 years from now. The accident itself had no consequences. But all of us need to face the fact that eventually we're going to die, whether it's coronavirus or old age or whatever it might be. C.S. Lewis also wrote, God whispers to us in our pleasure. He speaks to us in our conscience, but shouts to us in our pain. It is his megaphone to rouse a deaf world. But of course, the Christian can't begin to talk about suffering without referring to the person of Christ. For God himself suffered in Christ. He knows what it is to experience pain. He himself knew abandonment, pain, suffering, and ultimately death. He didn't remain apart from his world, saying, there, I'm sure it's all very nice for you down there. He suffered himself. The God in whom Christians believe and trust is a God who himself suffered. And by doing so, he changes the nature of our sufferings. He knows what it is like to experience pain and suffering. You see, the sufferings of this world, this earth, are for real. They are painful. And God too is deeply pained by our suffering, just as we are shocked and grieved and mystified by the suffering of our family and friends. God is with us in the suffering. And at the end of the book of Job, after all sorts of rational arguments that really got nowhere, God showed up and took Job on a tour of the universe and effectively said, do you understand how this works? Do you understand the way that creatures give birth? Do you understand the whirlwind, where the snow comes from? All these things. God never answered Job's question. But I think the most important thing, regardless almost of what God said, was that God showed up. God had not abandoned him. Philip Yancey, in one of his books, wrote rather provocatively that it didn't really matter what God said. He could have actually just read the telephone directory. What mattered was that God was there in the place of suffering. After the earthquake in Haiti back in 2010, John Sentamu, who is the Archbishop of York, commented, I have nothing to say that makes any sense of this horror. All I know is that the message of the death and resurrection of Jesus is that he is with us. So the coronavirus forces us to reflect not on necessarily where it came from or why God allows it, but what we're going to learn from it. And I put out just a few things that all of us should be learning from it. It reminds us of our own mortality, get my T's in the right place. We're all going to die. I'm going to die eventually. Who knows when? So what are we going to do with our lives now? Sadly, the surveys show that it's actually younger adults who now think more about their deaths as a result of the coronavirus. Not that they become morbid and downcast, but we need to have a realistic assessment that no matter what we try to do to delay it, inevitably, 100% certain, all of us eventually are going to die. And we're forced to remember that life is fragile. We're vulnerable, frail, dependent, mortal. We're not in total charge of our own destinies. We might like to think we have a scientific explanation of the world, and indeed we do. But science cannot cure all the things in life. When this is all over, are we going to go back to just meandering around as though nothing ever mattered? It challenges us to think about our own responsibilities, for Christians in particular. And throughout the ages, there have been a number of plagues that Christians have played particular parts in alleviating the suffering. Maybe the most famous one is the plague of Cyprian, as it's called. He was the archbishop, the bishop in Carthage in the 3rd century, when there was a plague, possibly Ebola, maybe smallpox, we don't know. Tragic. And he urged Christians to stay, to help the dying. And some of those that they were helping were those who previously been persecuting them, loving their enemies in a time of tragedy. Similarly, Martin Luther in the 16th century, when there was, again, a plague in Wittenberg, the question, should they flee or should they stay? And he wrote about that, asking Christians to stay, and he himself stayed in Wittenberg. It's been said that actually Christian revival often follow plagues as a result of the quality of Christians' lives, who didn't look after just themselves, but looked after those around them as well. And we've been all too well aware of those in our society who have given sacrificially as they've cared for the sick and the dying. The coronavirus exposes inequalities in our world and injustices in our society, as the poor suffer more than the rich. And it forces us to think about the things that really matter in life. Our friends, our companionship, Zoom meetings, YouTube, Teams, Skype, whatever it might be, they help. But they're absolutely no substitute for encounters with family and friends, of being able to put an arm around somebody and show them that you care. So we've ranged wide over these, thinking about this, why does God allow suffering? And we can be realistic about it. Suffering happens. God allows it. We can't properly understand why, but he certainly wants us to learn from it and to be better people and to be dependent upon him. So I thank you for your attention on that. I'm going to stop sharing my screen now, and we'll go back to Esther. I think it's going to take some questions, and anything goes, no holds barred. Throw them at me and tell me I'm wrong.
Thank you very much, Keith. I think that was really educational and insightful. At the moment, we only have 2 questions from our Google form. So if you guys watching still want to pop in some questions on that, we've got some time. So please continue asking questions. So our first question is, why can't God help us find a cure faster?
Right, okay. That's basically the way that science works. I think there are cures coming. I'm particularly interested in small molecules with antiviral agents, and you'll have seen the trials for some of those going on. And we need to be sure before something is released that it's properly tested. We don't want to be accused of killing people or giving people false hope. False hope is a terrible thing. And there are some examples out there, I'm not going to quote them, about where people are suggesting things that might work, and there's no evidence for it at all. And doing the science takes time. I seriously believe that God, in his grace, allows us to do science, that we can investigate the disease, we can try all sorts of things and test them out. Whether there will come a cure for it, I don't know. In terms of the vaccine, there has never yet been a vaccine for any coronavirus that's worked. Whether that's a form of the common cold or SARS or MERS or whatever those, I'm hopeful that colleagues who are biochemists and medics and immunologists and all those people eventually will come up with a virus. But doing science takes time. It's not just the click of a fingers. It's hard work, and that's part of the Christian responsibility. Is that God says this is what humans are supposed to do, to go and understand the world, to work at it, and that's not just a click of a fingers and it's done. But do the hard work. It's toil. Some of it's drudgery, but it takes time. Thank you for that question.
It definitely does. And I think it's really interesting also that Southampton's doing a lot of work to help out. So I think, yeah, recommend you guys look that up. I think there was a BBC Panorama about it, which was really interesting to watch. Our next question is, like in the story of Job, where he is tested by the devil, could this be what is happening today?
No, I don't think so. I mean, the book of Job, I mean, theologians debate as to whether that actually was a real thing or whether it's a bit of wisdom literature. It's a thought experiment, if you like, where what the thought is to why should anybody trust God? Do I just trust God because it's a sort of contract with him? I'll behave myself, God, and you look after me. That sort of contract. That's not the way that things work. Is that Job is asked the question, will you still trust God when things aren't going so good? Will you still trust in the kind of God that you believe in, and commit life to him, even though things are difficult? And that thought experiment, I think that still is relevant for us today, as we say, will you trust God when you don't know why there's suffering, why there's coronavirus? But I don't think that we could say this is the devil testing us at all. This is the way that nature works. If you get that sort of infectious virus that by whatever means has become endemic in the population, this is the way that nature works. Now, it may be mankind's mismanagement of nature that's allowed that to start. But once things go, that's just the way that cell biology and human physiology and biochemistry, that's just the way that it works. I don't think we need to see a devil behind it. Actually, it's a sign that God's world works. And if you mess with it, it works in ways that are messed up as well. I say again, it's a sign of God's grace that science actually works, that the world may not like the way that it works sometimes, but it's understandable, and we can work to sometimes work against that. Sorry, that's a bit of a rambling answer to I think what's quite a genuine question. Thank you.
That's all good. And our third and final question at the moment is, what do you believe to be the significance of the fall if suffering existed beforehand?
Yeah, I mean, it's quite clear that death existed in the world long before humans decided to rebel against God. But the fall itself had to do with my relationship with God. This is where humans said, I don't want to have anything to do with God. I'm not going to take any notice of the commands that you put upon us. And I'm going to go my own way. That's how I see the fall. And the consequence of that is that we're out of kilter with everything. We're out of kilter with our relationship with God. We're out of kilter with our relationship with each other. We're out of kilter with our relationship with the world. God in Christ starts to set those things straight with our relationship with him being restored. Our relationship, therefore, with each other should be restored. And our acknowledgement of the way that we should treat the world should also be restored. Work is still drudgery half the time. Even the science that's exciting, 95% of that is drudgery. But that we're called to work in this world. And remind me, take me back to the question again, because I've started to ramble. So remind me what that question was, Esther. You're muted for a moment.
Sorry. What do you believe to be the significance of the fall if suffering existed beforehand?
Yeah, so it come back to that. So we're out of kilter. We're by disobeying God, is that there are consequences for that. And there's a bit in the book of Romans in chapter 8 where it talks about all creation is groaning for the new creation to be revealed. And it's almost as though the world out there is saying, for goodness sake, human beings, get your act together and start behaving the way that you should do. Because when you do that, and that will only happen when Christ comes again in fulfillment. But when that happens, then nature itself will be looked after properly by humans. At the moment, we're abusing it in all sorts of ways. This ties on with things like global warming, like the way in which we're misusing the environment. If we did what God commanded us to do, and if we looked after and nurtured and curated nature properly, then things would be very, very different. And it's almost as though nature saying, come on, humans, get on with it. Do it properly.
Yeah. We've got a few more.
Go on then. Yeah, I'm in no hurry. There's nowhere you can go these days, so I'm trapped.
True, yeah. So this next one nicely links into what you said about nature. So if God keeps to the laws of nature, how can we explain miracles that go against the laws of nature?
Yeah, I mean, that's a good question. If God is God, he has established the way that the world works. So the laws of nature, as we might call them. And that's an act of grace, as I say, that there are laws in nature. Otherwise, gravity wouldn't work. Things wouldn't behave properly and reproducibly. But if God is God, he's quite able occasionally to come in and break his own rules. They're actually, are they rules themselves? They're descriptions of the way that the world works. And that God, if he's made them, he can come in and tweak them occasionally. Obviously, the fact we call them miracles is they're exceptions. They're not the standard thing that happens. Life, medicine, science is reproducible. But God, in his mercy, sometimes can come in, very rarely, can come in and change things. Why he should choose to do that on some occasions and most occasions don't, I don't know. That's in the counsel of God. But it's perfectly possible for God to step in. After all, he's set the thing going. He can change things. More often than not, I think miracles end up being miracles of timing rather than physical miracles. So I'm not excluding the possibilities of that. And miracles sometimes are God changing me and the way that I behave. But thank you for that question. Yeah, God, a scientific view of the world does not exclude the possibility of God stepping in to do miraculous things. And we see that exquisitely in the person of Jesus Christ. God himself doing miracles when he was here, doing the ultimate miracle, rising from the dead.
That was a really great answer to a good question. And finally, I think this one is just about the science going on behind the scenes. Someone's just asked, are you involved with any of the research, I presume at Southampton or Cambridge?
No, I'm not. I mean, I have colleagues in biological sciences and others in the School of Medicine who are involved. I'm one of those who's best kept out the way in isolation, not fiddling with things. I know those who are involved both in the design of vaccines, in the design of therapeutics, and involved in the diagnostics and the testing. And Southampton University is playing its part within that. And I'm proud of my colleagues. But personally, I can't claim any credit for any of that at all.
Well, thank you very much. That's all the questions that we have that have come through. And thank you to everyone who has sent in some questions. If you do have more, then Keith has very kindly said he's happy to continue answering your questions. We've put his email in the description of the Google form, and he's happy to get in touch with you and answer your questions. And as I've said before, we have our Question a Christian Facebook page, which is running continually. So please feel free to get in contact with us there. And finally, before we sign off, if you want to know more about what the Christian Union do, we have our weekly main meeting every Friday at 7:30 at suku.co.uk/unite. And keep your eyes peeled on our Facebook for an upcoming social, which I'm sure will be really good. So I think that's all that we have to say. Keith, have you got anything else you'd like to sign off with? If not,
no, I thank you for putting up with me. It's been a pleasure being with you. I wish I could see you. I wish I could see your faces and see the reactions you've all had, and see you all wanting to shoot me one after another. But then the thing is, I can just stare at my computer screen and I can see a picture of Esther and I can see a few names, but the rest of you, and I wish we could meet up sometime.
Yeah, we just got to pray that we can soon. So thank you so much, Keith, for all the work that you put in. I think everyone can agree that was really good. I hope you all enjoyed it, and we'll hopefully see you soon. That's really it.
Bye, everybody.
Bye.